Alright, finally picking back up with Napoleon's The Art of War and Power. Maxim 15. The first consideration with a general who offers battle should be the glory and honor of his arms. The safety and preservation of his men is only the second. But it is in the enterprise and courage resulting from the former that the latter will most assuredly be found. In a retreat, besides the honor of the army, the loss of life is often greater than in 2 battles. For this reason, we should never despair while brave men are to be found with their colors. It is by this means that we obtain victory and deserve to obtain it. Note, in 1645, the French army, under the orders of the Prince of Condé... Oh, now I'm reminded why I stopped recording this. I hate to come across as illiterate, but I have such a difficult time pronouncing these names. Places. Prince of Condé was on the march to lay siege to Nordlingen when it was discovered that Count Mercy, who commanded the Bavarians, had foreseen this intention and had entrenched himself in a strong position which defended Nordlingen at the same time that it covered Donauwörth. Notwithstanding the favorable position of the enemy, Condé ordered the attack. The combat was terrible. All the infantry in the center and on the right, after being successively engaged, was routed and dispersed in spite of the efforts of the cavalry and the reserve, which were likewise carried away with the fugitives. The battle was lost. Condé, in despair, having no longer either center or right to depend upon, collected the remnants of his battalions and directed his march to the left, where Turenne was still engaged. This perseverance reanimated the ardor of the troops. They broke the right wing of the enemy, and Turenne, by a change of front, returned to the attack upon his center. Night, too, favored the boldness of Condé. An entire corps of Bavarians, fancying themselves cut off, laid down their arms, and the obstinacy of the French general in this struggle for victory was repaid by possession of the field of battle, together with a great number of prisoners and almost all the enemy's artillery. The Bavarian army beat a retreat, and the next day Nordlingen capitulated. Maxim 16. It is an approved maxim in war never to do what the enemy wishes you to do, for this reason alone, that he desires it. A field of battle, therefore, which he has previously studied and reconnoitered, should be avoided, and double care should be taken where he has had time to fortify and entrench. One consequence deducible from this principle is never to attack a position in front which you can gain by turning. Note, it was without due regard to this principle that Marshal Villeroy, on assuming the command of the army of Italy during the campaign of 1701, attacked with an unwarrantable presumption Prince Eugene of Savoy in his entrenched position of Chiari on the Oglio. The French generals, Catinat, among the rest, considered the post unassailable, but Villeroy insisted, and the result of this otherwise unimportant battle was the loss of the elite of the French army. It would have been greater still but for Catinat's exertions. It was by neglecting the same principle that the Prince of Condé, in the campaign of 1644, failed in all his attacks upon the entrenched position of the Bavarian army. The Count Mercy, who commanded the latter, had drawn up his cavalry skillfully upon the plain, resting upon Freiburg, while his infantry occupied... that's Freiburg, right? Because German, F-R-E-I, be Frei. Upon Freiburg, while his infantry occupied the mountain. After many fruitless attempts, the Prince of Condé, seeing the impossibility of dislodging the enemy, began to menace his communications, but the moment Mercy perceived this, he broke up his camp and retired beyond the Black Mountains. The greatest part about this book is the illustrations here. The facing page, Prince Eugene of Savoy's victory at the Battle of Chiari, 1st of September 1701, was largely the result of an ill-conceived maneuver by the French under the command of Marshal Villeroy. Keen for a swift and decisive victory, Villeroy launched a frontal attack on the well-entrenched imperial forces who, firing from point-blank range, forced the French to retreat. And just rows of men, some on horseback with their swords, their cannons. Looks like A house or two is on fire. Really cool stuff. Maxim 17. In a war of march and maneuver, if you would avoid a battle with a superior army, it is necessary to entrench every night and occupy a good defensive position. Those natural positions which are ordinarily met with are not sufficient to protect an army against superior numbers without recourse to art. Goodness. Note: the campaign of the French and Spanish army, commanded by the Duke of Berwick, against the Portuguese in the year 1706, affords a good lesson on this subject. The two armies made almost the tour of Spain. They began the campaign near Badajoz, and after maneuvering across both Castiles, finished it in the kingdoms of Valencia and Murcia. The Duke of Berwick encamped his army 85 times, and although the campaign passed without a general action, he took about 10,000 prisoners from the enemy. Marshal Turenne also made a fine campaign of maneuver against the Count Montecuccoli in 1675. The imperial army having made its arrangements to pass the Rhine at Strasbourg, Turenne used all diligence, and throwing a bridge over the river near the village of Ottenheim, 3 leagues below Strasbourg, he crossed with the French army and encamped close to the little town of Vilstedt, which he occupied. This position covered the bridge of Strasbourg, so that by this maneuver Turenne deprived the enemy of all approach to that city. Upon this, Montecuccoli made a movement with his whole army, threatening the bridge at Ottenheim, by which the French received their provisions from Upper Alsace. As soon as Turenne discovered the design of the enemy, he left a detachment at Vilstedt and made a rapid march with his whole force upon the village of Altenheim. This intermediate position between the two bridges, which he wished to preserve, gave him the advantage of being able to succor either of these posts before the enemy had time to carry them. Montecuccoli, seeing that any successful attack upon the bridges was not to be expected, resolved to pass the Rhine below Strasbourg, and, with this view, returned to his first position at Offenburg. Marshal Turenne, who followed all the movements of the Austrian army, brought back his army also to Vilstedt. In the meantime, this attempt of the enemy having convinced the French general of the danger to which his bridge had exposed him, removed it nearer to that of Strasbourg in order to diminish the extent of ground he had to defend. Montecuccoli, having commanded the magistrates of Strasbourg to collect materials for a bridge, moved to Schurzheim to receive them, but Turenne again defeated his projects by taking a position at Freystedt, where he occupied the islands of the Rhine and immediately constructed a stockade. Thus it was that, during the whole of this campaign, Turenne succeeded in gaining the initiative of the enemy and obliging him to follow his movements. He succeeded also, by a rapid march, in cutting off Montecuccoli from the town of Offenburg, whence he drew his supplies, and would no doubt have prevented the Austrian general from effecting his junction with the corps of Caprara, had not a cannon shot terminated this great man's life. Maxim 18. A general of ordinary talent, occupying a bad position and surprised by a superior force, seeks his safety in retreat, but a great captain supplies all deficiencies by his courage and marches boldly to meet the attack. By this means he disconcerts his adversary, and if the latter shows any irresolution in his movements, a skillful leader, profiting by his indecision, may even hope for victory or at least employ the day in maneuvering. At night he entrenches himself or falls back to a better position. By this determined conduct he maintains the honor of his arms, the first essential to all military superiority. Note: in 1653, Marshal Turenne was surprised by the Prince of Condé in a position where his army was completely compromised. He had the power, indeed, by an immediate retreat, of covering himself by the Somme, which he possessed the means of crossing at Péronne, and whence he was distant only half a league, but fearing the influence of this retrograde movement on the morale of his army, Turenne balanced all disadvantages by his courage, and marched boldly to meet the enemy with very inferior forces. After marching a league, he found an advantageous position where he made every disposition for a battle. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but the Spaniards, exhausted with fatigue, hesitated to attack him, and Turenne, having covered himself with entrenchments during the night, the enemy no longer dared to risk a general action and broke up his camp. Picture of, or painting of, Marshal Turenne here. was Louis XIV's greatest general? Maxim 19. The transition from the defensive to the offensive is one of the most delicate operations. Note: by studying the first campaign of Napoleon in Italy, we can learn what genius and boldness may effect in passing with an army from the defensive to the offensive. The army of the Allies, commanded by General Beaulieu, Beaulieu, was provided with every means and that could render it formidable. Its force amounted to 80,000 men and 200 pieces of cannon. The French army, on the contrary, could number scarcely 30,000 men under arms and 30 pieces of cannon. For some time there had been no issue of meat, and even the bread was irregularly supplied. The infantry was ill-clothed, the cavalry wretchedly mounted. All the draft horses had perished from want, so that the service of the artillery was performed by mules. To remedy these evils, large disbursements were necessary, and such was the state of the finances that the government had only been able to furnish 2,000 louis in specie for the opening of the campaign. The French army could not possibly exist in this state. To advance or retreat was absolutely necessary. Aware of the advantage of surprising the enemy at the very outset of the campaign by some decisive blow, Napoleon prepared for it by recasting the morale of his army. In a proclamation full of energy, he reminded them that an ignoble death alone remained for them if they continued on the defensive, that they had nothing to expect from France, but everything to hope from victory. "Abundance courts you in the fertile plains of Italy," said he. "Are you deficient, soldiers, in constancy or in courage?" Profiting by the moment of enthusiasm which he had inspired, Napoleon concentrated his forces in order to fall with his whole weight on the different corps of the enemy. Immediately afterwards, the battles of Melissimo and Mondovi added fresh confidence to the high opinion already entertained by the soldier for his chief, and that army which only a few days ago was encamped amid barren rocks and consumed by famine, already aspired to the conquest of Italy. In 1 month after the opening of the campaign, Napoleon had terminated the war with the King of Sardinia and conquered the Milanese. Rich cantonments soon dispelled from the recollection of the French soldier the misery and fatigue attendant on this rapid march, while a vigilant administration of the resources of the country reorganized the material of the French army and created the means necessary for the attainment of future success. Maxim 20. It may be laid down as a principle that the line of operations should not be abandoned, but it is one of the most skillful maneuvers in war, to know how to change it when circumstances authorize or render this necessary. An army which changes skillfully its line of operation deceives the enemy, who becomes ignorant where to look for its rear or upon that weak points it is assailable. Note: Frederick sometimes changed his line of operation in the middle of a campaign, but he was enabled to do this because he was maneuvering at that time in the center of Germany, an abundant country capable of supplying all the wants of his army in case his communications with Prussia were intercepted. Marshal Turenne, in the campaign of 1746, gave up his line of communication to the Allies in the same manner, but, like Frederick, he was carrying on the war at this time in the center of Germany, and having fallen with his whole forces upon Rhein, he took the precaution of securing to himself a depot upon which to establish his base of operation. By a series of maneuvers, marked alike by audacity and genius, he subsequently compelled the imperial army to abandon its magazines and retire into Austria for winter quarters. But these are examples which it appears to me should only be imitated when we have taken full measure of the capacity of our adversary, and above all when we see no reason to apprehend an insurrection in the country to which we transfer the theater of war. And I'll go ahead and call it quits for part 3 right there.